Yay, well, thank you so much for that nice introduction, Mickey. That's super generous of you. Yeah, and thank you all for coming. I mean, this is a tough day. I know you're either really committed DH people or not very politically committed. I don't know. Maybe both. No, we'll go with DH committed, and we'll run downtown after this, right? Well, no, thank you. I mean, this is a good talk for me to give you all right now, because it's right in the sort of thick of a project I'm working on, a book project, and it's kind of bookending the book project in a sense. It's sort of towards the beginning of the book and towards the end of the book in terms of what I'm going to present here. Focusing on, I mean, the book title I'm still sort of tossing around, but I think I'm going to call it an archaeological microhistory of something, something, something. But spatial ethnohistory is really at the core of this as well. And our ethnohistory conference here in town centered on space and place this year. It's very exciting to see the amount of intellectual work going into explicitly spatial kinds of approaches to ethnohistory. So I'll talk a little bit about that, about my approach, and thinking about this as a DH Center talk, sort of a little bit on how I go about doing the work, and so I'll give you a little roadmap here. So yeah, I'll talk about spatial ethnohistory, talk about this particular context in which over 1 million people were resettled in the Andes in one fell swoop. It was a massive resettlement project that occurred in the Andes, and the problems that came with that, foremost for the people it affected, of course, but also for colonial administration and problems of the local working out of power. And so working through this sequence, I'll talk about the process of resettlement, torn apart from one's home, torn out of your context, displaced, literally, then bound together in what were called reducciones, or reduction towns, right? And then we'll go inside the reduction town itself, and I'll show you a little bit about, that's sort of the middle of the book, actually, sort of the way that I think we can understand the internal organization of the town more from an archaeological perspective, a particular reduction from an archaeological perspective. And then the last bit is on sort of how the Andean landscape continued to assert itself despite resettlement. So what happens, of course, in Spanish colonialism is through the first decades of colonial administration, essentially Spanish administrators are parasitic on local forms of authority. They're basically administering through former mechanisms of Inca imperialism, and so they're dependent on local agents, local authorities, and that puts them in a very, very difficult position as people are displaced. They're moved away from their productive resources, their agricultural fields, and the pastoralists of the Andes are suddenly expected to stay in one place, which is not a good thing either. So the landscape continues to assert itself in this story, and then the last bit, what happens when this particular reduction falls apart. So sort of the big sweeping picture here is about, in the abstract for this talk, I talked about Patricia Seed and how her interesting work comparing English and Spanish colonialism, in which she says, English colonialism produced the land survey, Spanish colonialism produced the census. English colonialism proceeds through the extraction of resources. Spanish colonialism also resources, but through agents, through people. And so what's interesting from a sort of methodologically here is that the Spanish didn't really, they were really bad map makers. They really didn't do a good job keeping track of resources. They were more interested in the people, but the censuses that they produced were incredibly intricate and as detailed really as a modern census or cadastral survey where you're also tracking people's resources. So I'll sort of take us along in the process of how you get spatial information out of those seemingly non-spatial, aspatial kinds of information sources. So spatial ethnohistory, we could use it as we could use an analogy of ethnohistory here. So ethnohistory could be sort of defined as the history of an ethnos, right, of a people. So the history of an indigenous people usually, via written records not of their making or not of their conception, let's say. Sort of the traditional way that we think of ethnohistory, but there's a second sense in which we could think of ethnohistory as sort of more like ethnohistoricity, right? Ethnohistory like ethnoscience. So ethnohistory as history as a body of or system of knowledge, right? So we could do that both ways here, where if we're doing spatial ethnohistory, we're doing the recovery or the representation, if you're more comfortable with that approach here, of otherwise latent indigenous spatial structures and practices from documentation not of indigenous origin or production. And then so we could call it spatial ethnohistoricity in a sense, the exploration of indigenous spatial historicities, how culturally specific forms of historicity is embedded in the landscape, right? And that's really, really important in the Andes, where the landscape is the ancestors. The landscape is a living landscape populated by deities who are your ancestors and to whom you owe your existence to. And so, you know, not just in terms of the nuts and bolts of agriculture and the logistics and so forth, does this sort of almost agential sort of pull of the landscape play in this story, but the sort of cosmological and, for lack of a better term, for shorthand, we could call it religious, you know, sorts of concepts that are embedded in the landscape. So I'm going to mostly talk about the first variant here and a little bit of, I guess you'll be able to infer where the second aspect here comes into this story. Okay, so so in the Andes, this probably isn't too much interest to some of you, but in the Andes, sort of Andean anthropology in general, you might say, really was modern Andean anthropology was born in the 50s and 60s when people started to use, scholars started to use sources other than the chronicles, essentially, and started to use primarily censuses, administrative records, broader sets of documents in the archives, you know, digging into parish records, digging into legal proceedings and so forth, to excavate dimensions of indigenous social life that the chroniclers just either couldn't understand or weren't interested in or misrepresented for whatever reason, right? And a really key part of this was spatial. So John Mura, one of the sort of leading figures in mid-century Andean anthropology, his whole framework was built on a spatial model of Andean social organization is rooted in this vertical sort of ecology or ecological complementarity, as it's often called, whereby the peoples of the Andes, unique, it would seem, in the world, integrated the different parts of the Andes, the different ecological tiers of the Andes, not through markets, but through direct exchange within a single ethnic group, as was the usual mechanism. So totally different from Mesoamerica in that sense, or other places in the Americas. but it was really general. It was a very coarse kind of general model of how Andean space was conceived and used. And a lot of the details we couldn't even begin to address just because of the technical difficulty of turning censuses and turning what are called visitas, right, which are administrative surveys by the Spanish, into something spatial, right? It's a lot of steps involved, and you would have to, if you had to do this by hand, it would be a lot of work. So now we can do this with GIS, with Geographic Information System. So here comes the digital humanities dimension of this, right? So now we can bring these spatial structures and practices out of the documents. What are latent spatial information can become more explicit. So, essentially what we need to do this is take place name data in the documents and put it on a map by matching them with their modern counterparts, or at least their counterparts from historical maps. And these could be village names, these could be provinces, they could be sort of general, vague administrative or jurisdictional kinds of entities, like what's called a comarca, which is like a kind of a domain. So some of these are easy to represent, some are more problematic to represent, but they can be represented spatially. And then we can build in either a data table or a database with the information associated with each of these places. And then we can query the database and view them as spatial distributions on the map, and sort of ABCs of a basic historical GIS. But what we're doing here then is we're adding the sort of the ethno dimension to this, the sort of anthropological dimension of this, which requires other kinds of information and knowledge about other peoples. Whether that comes from ethnography, it comes from archaeology, it comes from other sources. Okay, so that's where it gets more sort of interdisciplinary. So in the Kula Valley, this is a UAV shot that we took last summer towards the end of the season. This was actually the last day we were in the field. This is in the middle of the Kula Valley. Just gives you a sense of this landscape, right? It's completely anthropogenic. This is on the western slopes of the Andes, where it's semi-arid, completely dependent on irrigation for reliable yields in agriculture. And so this is a massive infrastructural system, right? If you resettle people, it's going to have consequences on these elaborate systems. And so the Spanish, with resettlement, took a huge risk, both for colonial extractive ends and for the communities themselves, of course, by displacing people away from their productive resources. And so, but that's what happened. In the 1570s, a viceroy is sent from Spain, actually in 1569, with a mandate to sort of hammer out the formal structure of colonial governance in Peru after a generation of basically chaos in the Andes. There was infighting among the Spanish. The Spanish silver mines were failing. There was an Inca revolt in Vilcabamba. The encomenderos, the Spanish elite, had pretensions of separating from the Spanish crown. Gonzalo Pizarro claimed himself to be king. All kinds of crazy stuff was going on. And Francisco de Toledo comes, and the sort of centerpiece of his reforms was the general resettlement of Indians, or the Reducción General de Indios, which, unlike in Mesoamerica, where resettlement was basically a gradual process that proceeded through the Franciscans and the Dominicans, it was a religious kind of project that proceeded more or less kind of gradually. In the Andes, that happens, as you'll see, but it's like truncated with this huge project that comes in the 1570s when over 1,000 towns were built. And so we're trying to map out where these are. Believe it or not, as I say, the Spanish didn't keep good maps, so there was no master map. We don't even know of a master list of all these. but we're starting to map out. We've got maybe a little less than half of them mapped out through this gazetteer project that I'm co-directing with Akira Saito in the National Museum of Ethnology in Japan and some others, where we're building this online platform to do that through NEH grant. So it's a big sort of historiographical problem. What are the effects of this over the short, medium, and long term? So we've seen shifting historiographical frameworks around this. The early ones were sort of, Toledo brought rational governance to Peru. Then it was, it's sort of black legend stuff almost. Toledo's a oppressor to, and sort of models of indigenous resistance to it, to where we're at now, which is more of a kind of model of local entanglement and negotiation, and we're seeing that actually it wasn't just a form of sort of imposition and domination in local landscapes, but there was actually quite a bit of negotiation on both sides of this in terms of where these were built, how many were built, how they were organized, etc. But running through all this was the question of whether we could say that this project succeeded or failed in achieving its goals, which I think is kind of not the right question to ask, because you only have to ask really succeeded or failed from whose point of view, for one thing. That's a problem, and that's a pretty blunt kind of analytical question to be asking in the first place. And also, it was a very complex ideological project. It wasn't just the idea of resettlement or congregation or reduction. I wouldn't necessarily gloss this as just reduction. So William Hanks wrote a brilliant book recently sort of exploring how this ideology of reducción permeated so many dimensions of Spanish colonialism, including even things like grammars. So they called, this is a Spanish grammar of Yucatec Maya, in which they say that the language is reducido a sucintas reglas there. So they're using the term reduction to this idea of bringing to a new order, to rationalize, to reorient, to sort of convert, in a sense, the language itself, so that the language becomes an instrument of conversion, a kind of penetrating reorientation of the subject. Right? So the Reducción General in Peru is, you could say, is a kind of culmination of that ideology, and I'm playing around with this idea of this as a sort of semiotic ideology. In other words, it's a basic orientation around how signs act in the world. It's a key sort of symbolic framing for Spanish colonialists. And the idea here then is that if you build these urban spaces in a particular way, it will make these subjects and these communities into proper subjects of the king, into proper civic communities. The idea is that, the city is a kind of implantation of divine order in nature, and so that the built environment is almost determinative in its kind of social effects kind of idea. So, but of course, it's more complicated than that, as we know through practice theory and other bodies of modern theory around the built environment and its effects. So the question is then, how does this happen in particular places to see how this plays out? And that really requires sustained analysis in particular places, which is what I've been doing. So now we're down in the southern Andean highlands, south central Andean highlands. The western slopes, you can get a sense of how dry it is on the coast, one of the driest deserts in the world. Lake Titicaca there in the Altiplano. And so the Kula Valley is situated here. It's up high, between 3,000 and 4,000 meters above sea level, up to the valley rim, and the high plains are over 5,000 meters above sea level. So this is very high altitude, but these were big populations. Home of the Coyagua ethnic group, who were Aymara-speaking people, and the Cabana people of the lower part of the Kula Valley were Quechua speakers. Really interesting two language groups right next to each other in the same valley. On the order of 70,000 people on the eve of the conquest. By the time Toledo comes and they do the first census, it's down to around 34,000 for the province, so halved in 30 odd years, 30 to 40 years. And they're resettled into these reducción towns. So these are the pink polygons. There we go. Can't see the laser, but you see the pink polygons there. Those are the reducción towns I'm talking about. And so for the past, I guess, 7 years almost now, I've been working in the upper part of the valley here near the modern town of Tuti. And so this is where the archaeological site of Machu Yacta, as it's known. So everybody's heard of Machu Picchu. Machu just means ancient or old, and Yacta means town, sort of. And so there's a lot of Machu Yactas in Peru, as you can imagine. It's a Quechua term for old town. And so the modern community sees Machu Yacta as their ancestral town. So it's a really well-preserved example of a Toledan reducción. Many of the other villages, I'll go back here for a second, these are also original Toledan reducciones where people still live today. Okay, so this is what it looks like a little closer in. There's the modern town of Tuti down below, 3,850 meters above sea level, and the old town is at 3,950 more or less, almost 4,000 meters above sea level, about 13,800 I think, or 14,000 feet. Up in the high altitude grasslands, what we know as the Puna in the Andes, which is really above kind of effective agriculture, pastoralism, lots of alpacas and funny-looking llamas and goofy animals walking around. But very important economically. This part of the Andes is really famous for its massive camelid herds in the hundreds of thousands. I mean, it's really was the real source of wealth, especially for the upper part of the Kula Valley, for the Coyaguas. The Coyaguas were really known for their wool production, fine wool, and so forth. So that's where we're at in terms of the geography of the place. And this is a little snapshot of the town today and what it looks like. And so this is where people were brought from hamlets and villages, from both agricultural communities and pastoralist communities. And we've been able to sort of piece this together, the sort of microhistory of resettlement, pretty well. So we haven't done a real systematic archaeological survey of this part of the valley, but we know where the big sites are, let's say, where the principal sites were. We're not missing anything major. And so there's 5 here on the map. There's a few more, but these are the most important ones we need to consider. And I've worked down here at the site of Malata prior to this current project. And Malata was, as you'll see, was occupied during the Inca times, through the conquest, and became an early kind of doctrinal settlement under Franciscan administration, and then they were resettled. So that's the very first move that we see is from so the Auquimarcas site, we think, was resettled to Malata under Franciscan occupation when Malata's converted into a Franciscan doctrinal settlement, and it falls out. Malata grows. There's a sort of an initial pulse of resettlement, and it looks like this. So this is another drone video we shot this past summer to give you a sense of what these sites look like. Really well-preserved architecture. We wanted to work here first because we wanted to trace the historical trajectory from this initial evangelization through to the general resettlement. And so these linear arranged houses down here are probably the added on houses. They're colonial and dating. And they're down at the end of the site. And then we come into the old sort of core of the site, which is circular houses, totally different house forms, with this one exception, which is really interesting. This is an intrusive house, which we think was where the principal indigenous family lived, right next to this plaza, with this sort of administrative building and a chapel with its atrium around it. And so the chapel is very prominently placed here within the settlement. We excavated the chapel. We excavated in about 10 different houses at that site. And so we have the sense that there's a clear initial pulse of resettlement in the 1540s. This is really, really early, 1540s to 1560s. Sort of at the other end of the spectrum, we've found, in terms of ecological context, the other end of the spectrum, another site way, way, way up high that has the same characteristics, has a little chapel like that as well, we think is probably from that earliest period of evangelization as well. And so we have this initial Franciscan presence, and then with the resettlement under Toledo, these are abandoned and reducciones are built. And so we think that, well, actually what's interesting is there's a list of the original reducciones, and we've only identified about half of them in the valley. And we think that one of them is the site of Coimo, which appears in that place name appears in the census documents, and local folks associate that place name with that area where there's an archaeological site today, which you'll see here. So this little zoom into Coimo is sort of this area here. This is modern Tuti. That's Mount Chiyacta up there. And if we zoom into Coimo, or what's known as Laika today, there's actually a church right here. You can't really make it out. It's a big church. It's much bigger than, so here's the church. This is a model we created. So there's the church there. So there's an Inca road that runs through it. There's an Inca Great Hall. This is sort of the domestic part of the site. It's kind of choppy. And then there's another Inca imperial structure there. And the church sort of sits down in the middle of this kind of amphitheater area. The scale of the church is much bigger than these Franciscan chapels we're finding. So we think that this is this original reduction of Coimo that appears in the original list, but disappears in subsequent censuses. So the next census after the initial general resettlement census is in 1591. So sometime between 1573, more or less, when the general resettlement occurs, and 1591, this is abandoned. So it's less than 20 years because it doesn't show up in 1591 at all. And so those folks, there's the church there. So it's very, these are standing architecture, very well preserved. No guesswork here in terms of what these buildings are, let's say. So it appears to be the case then that Coimo would have been subject to a second resettlement as Mount Chiyacta, or Santa Cruz de Tuti, does appear in the 1591 documents and subsequent censuses all the way up into the mid-19th century, as you'll see. So there were probably individuals and families that lived from being resettled from an original Inca site to Malata, from Malata to Coimo, and from Coimo to Mount Chiyacta. 3 or 4 moves in a lifetime. So multiple pulses of displacement from this kind of breadbasket down here of agricultural fields and terraces up into the high altitude Puna. So this is now up in Mount Chiyacta. You get a sense of the setting. Now we're really getting up there in the high altitude Andes. These are some of the highest human settlements, permanently human occupied settlements in the world, really, on par with the Himalayas in that sense. Yeah, so it's set in this sort of big bowl, cirque kind of thing, with a big spring running through it. It's a high altitude spring. You can see the lush vegetation running through here. It's kind of swampy through here. Those are really key resource patches in the high altitude. This is where the best forage is for alpacas. And so this is really where you see people congregating in general in the high altitude. So, and we know that there was a major Inca, not just site there, but an Inca probably administrative center there, because we have cut stone masonry like we see only at big Inca centers. In fact, the church is made out of those Inca cut stone blocks. We get lots of fine Inca ceramics. So there was a really major Inca administrative center. It appears that, you know, the placement of this town was largely probably political in that sense, because the primary kinds of actors that would be at an Inca administrative site would have been present there, right? And the idea would have been, well, this is where the biggest site already is. This is where the power brokers are. This is where the principal settlement's going to be. This is where the reduction is going. So why Laika, why Koima was abandoned, we're not exactly sure. But it does appear that this became a congregation point because of its probably political prominence and importance in this part of the valley. So people are sort of bound together in this reduction. So we'll move to thinking about now the internal organization of the town. And yeah, we're up high. It's big. It's half a kilometer on a side. There's over 500 buildings, and it's in really, really good shape in terms of the architecture. So the sort of middle part of the book is on dwelling, and we're trying to explore kind of the experience of living there, the experience of moving through the town, and what you would see, how you would visually experience the town. And in that sense, it's a kind of ideal place for this kind of study. If it's the case that the built environment was supposed to be doing stuff, right, which was the idea of the whole resettlement project, then it's important for us to understand what the built environment was composed of and how it was arranged and how it was organized and so forth. So, so we've spent a lot of time doing that work, which I won't go into really much detail, but gives you a sense of the layout. This was actually the arched entry into the village, so it sort of frames the whole entry, and there's a really freaked out cow right there. And yeah, so yeah, and gridded town, right? Gridded 40 by 40 meter gridded town blocks with regular, you know, street layout, all the hallmarks of what we would expect from a Toledan reduction, with a big giant church in the middle that's like 50 meters long. This is the parish around the church where the priest would have resided right here. This is the sacristy of the church. We excavated this whole block this past summer, along with several indigenous households in the community. And I say indigenous households because we know from the documents that there were no Spaniards in the censuses. They were the only Spaniard to live in these towns was supposed to be the priest. And we do have examples in other parts of the valley where there'll be somebody who's registered as Sambo or Negro or something like that, a black person or somebody of different ethnic origin. But nobody like that is registered in these censuses in this town. Here's an indigenous elite household that occupies a whole block. So yeah, so there's the street defining the block, and then here's this big patio. And what's probably going on here, so that was part of the plan. So Toledo specified that you were supposed to give an entire block to the curacas, or the headmen, the lords, and they would host. They would host essentially sort of commensal feasts in an attempt to maintain sort of good fortune and goodwill amongst their community members. So we've made quite a bit of progress in terms of documenting the site and how it's organized. In terms of the built environment. And fortunately, it's also one of the best documented sites or reducciones in terms of the written record as well. I'll talk about that next in terms of the internal organization. So this is what these visitas actually look like when you pull them out of the archives. And at first it looks pretty hopeless. So this is pretty early. This is from 1604. But they're very, very systematic, as I say. So this is like the header for the town of Coporake. You can read that. That's pretty easy, Coporake. And so the way that they're organized is, so in the Andes, ethnic groups are subdivided between usually moieties, which are like big clans, two halves. And then within each moiety, and the moieties are ranked, Anan Saya for upper, higher rank, Urin Saya for lower rank moiety. Within that, you have segmentary organization. So here comes the ethnohistory, right? So you have lineages that are called ayus, right? And they're named. These lineages are named. They have names, and they have the names usually imply a rank, and they have a headman. And under Inca administration, the ayu becomes a unit of administration. So they tie those into a decimal administrative structure so that usually ayus, a sort of basal level ayu is 50 or 100 households. And then you stack those into groups of 500 households and 1,000 households and on up to 10,000 households, which was the maximal unit of Inca decimal administration. So very, very formal imperial administration. Same thing happens under Inca administration where they're piggybacking on that same organization. So here you have Ayo, they're spelling Ayo with an O, A-Y-L-L-O, Ayo Koyana, Koyana, which is royal Ayu, like the high-ranking Ayu. So they're sort of listing them in rank probably. And then it says, of who, de que el principal, the headman is Don Pedro Quispe. Okay, so it's saying who the headman is, and his second in charge, his lieutenant, okay, and on and on. So then what it does is it goes through every tributary household within that ayu, tributario, and there's Don Pedro Quispe, the same guy, his spouse, their daughter, who's 3 years old, and another daughter who's 4, and then it goes first field, agricultural field, in such and such place. A topo, which is an Andean unit of measure of a field of maize. Okay, so there's our key thing for the spatial aspect, right? So it gives us place names, it gives us the crop that was grown normally, or if they have livestock, it lists those as well, and the size of the field as well. Okay, so there's a lot of information there. Okay. Most basically, you have demographic information. There are about 1,000 people. If we combine the two, we don't have a census run from a single year, but we have, because they were conducted by moiety. So you had a census for the lower half and a census for the upper half. And the closest we have is a pair from 1604 and 1617. So about 1,000 people at the turn of the 17th century. And 2 of them are registered as the principal ayus, okay? More ethnohistory here, okay? So, so the principal ayu would have been, the headman of each principal ayu would have been responsible for collecting the tribute for the whole moiety, for the whole Anan Saya, and for the whole Urin Saya. So those are really important administratively in that sense. So if we look at those 2, okay, so remember the names here. So Pahana Kaloka is the principal ayu of Anan Saya, the upper ranking moiety. Therefore, the headman of this ayu is the headman for the whole village, both Anan Saya and Urin Saya as the ranking member of the upper moiety. So Pahana Kaloka has almost half the population in the village. So the principal ayu what is it, about 40, I probably calculated this, does it come up? It's 40-something% of the population, which is a big clue, right? That's a clue. That probably means that these folks resided there originally, or they're descendants of the original people of that place, of Mount Chillacta, when it was an Inca settlement. If we go on the assumption that they were displacing people, the powerful people, minimally, right? Okay, so if we follow this through, the other principal Ayu is not very big. It's only 67 people, but it stands out with Pahanakaloka and other dimensions, as we'll see. And the rest of these are really tiny. So there's only 3 Ayus in Anansaya, and one of them's like half the village. And then we have little tiny fragments of Ayus over here, which is interesting. Little sort of segments or pieces of Ayus. So if we look at the declarations here, so if we take on the assumption that the original descendants probably would have been pastoralists, because this is a pastoralist community, it's in a pastoralist ecological context, then we can infer quite a bit on a per capita basis of their what they declared in the censuses. So Pahanakaloka has the highest per capita livestock declarations, and Taipi Pataka, the other principal Ayu, has the second highest livestock declarations. Another clue here that these were pastoralist Ayus. They were likely descendants of the originary inhabitants of the village. Okay, so I think that the 2 ranking Ayus were original residents during Inca times of this site, and if we look at agricultural land holdings on a per capita basis, these little fragments have, so now we're looking at the orange bars, or the kind of yellowish bars, the lighter ones. These little fragments are agriculturalist Ayus. They have more land per capita, so they're probably resettled from down below, right? So now we can really start to think about this in terms of displacement of who specifically within the community and its potential effects and its potential politics, right? So we can then go inside the site and even begin to maybe disentangle or reconstruct where they resided. So what's interesting is these reducciones are often divided between the Anansaya and Urinsaya moiety. And so I think we've been able to figure out where that division lies. So we went out and did an architectural survey, and so that we used the base imagery from the UAVs and traced out the architecture in a GIS, a mobile GIS. We took really intensive ceramic collections at the site, and then we can interpolate that into a surface, right, of ceramic densities. And this one is the Inca era ceramics at the site. So it's a heat map of where the diagnostic Inca era ceramics are. So obviously we see a big concentration down here on the southern end of the site and a big concentration on the northern end of the site. Okay, so I'll move through this a little quickly just so you get a sense. So this is early colonial, where it starts to become more generalized as this is a colonial town and so forth. So if that's the case, and if you look at the center of the site, it's actually where the grid is least regular, which is kind of weird. That's where you would expect the grid to be most regular. And it's probably because it's built around an Inca trapezoidal plaza. And there's the trapezoidal plaza. Typical of Inca installations, especially important state sort of centers. And then that's a heat map of, or kind of a density map of the Inca cutstone masonry. We only find it in this part of the site. So yeah, it's interesting that it's either that there was a kind of elite complex there at the center of the site, or they moved all the cutstone masonry to that church, and it was deemed appropriate only to use that in the church and the church area. So we think that we've got sort of the makings of the central part of the Inca site here, with the plaza in the center, a ceremonial platform over here, and then what's known as a cancha, or kind of elite administrative compound off the plaza, which we just infer because that's typical of Inca installations. So Will McCollum did his BA honors thesis on that work. It's really cool. So we even have stuff like this. So this is like this is really sort of spatial history, but literally like reading out the space of the settlement. So this is from a parish inventory where they read out the space of the Casa de los Curas, which is the priest's house, which we know is this. And then it says, in front of it is the Plaza Real, the royal plaza. So the Inca plaza was the royal plaza, which is interesting. And then it says there's a royal street that crosses it. And then there's another royal street that runs behind the house of the priests. And then it says there are two fountains, two fonts, which we found. It's just incredible, the detail in this thing. And then it says there's this plazuela, which is sort of a little plaza-like thing over here, which is actually odd because it seems the most monumental when you go to the site. There's 6 chapels around that plazuela, and there's a cross pedestal in the center. But it's this Plaza Real, which seems to be the principal plaza that orients the site. So the site is oriented around an Inca trapezoidal plaza. Okay, so if it's the case that this is our principal plaza, then this is likely the principal axis of division in the site. That's what we see at other reducciones as well. And if we take that and we look at our ceramic distributions with a lot of Inca stuff going on down here and then some Inca stuff over there, it's very likely that we have the Anansaya moiety here because that's where the bulk of that one Ayu with almost half of the population likely resided, and that we have the lower moiety there. So this would have been mostly pastoralist households. This would have been mostly agriculturalist households, right? So then what are the implications of this, right? So of course the landscape is there. It's imposing it. It's just sitting there imposing itself in a sense. What we were able to do is map out where all these places are, where all these agricultural fields are. So we built a database to enter the data from the visitas, and then we went out and interviewed people for the place names. We looked for the place names that are in the visitas, and we have a map of all those places. And in this context where irrigation is so important, place names are very specific. It's like maybe even just a few agricultural fields have a distinct name. And that's used for the distribution of irrigation water, and it's made for land claims vis-a-vis the Ministry of Agriculture, so they continue to be important all the way up to the present. So we mapped out 98 toponyms from the censuses, from these colonial censuses, and so we were able to map out about 27% overall of the land holdings that were declared in the censuses. So then what we did is we literally traced, with Hallie Thurber, a student from American University, did her master's thesis on this, traced all the trails. And we can run a network analysis out to the fields from Mount Chillacta and calculate how long it would take, or at least estimate how long it would take, and sort of estimate traffic patterns as they move. The congregation point is interestingly right there at Koimo. I'm moving through this quick because I want to get to the main point here, which is about the sort of penalty of resettlement. So this is Uri Saya. There's not really any difference. So now if we take Koimo, where people resided before they were resettled a second time as the starting point, we see pretty significant differences. So I'm going to skip ahead. Okay, so these are our walking times from Koimo. These are our walking times from up above. So there's about it's on the order of an hour penalty, essentially, of walking time to get to your agricultural fields from Mount Chillacta versus Koimo. And so you can imagine on a day in, day out, 1 hour each way penalty. That's putting a lot of strain and stress on the agriculturalists in the town. So Laika or Koimo, the original place that the agriculturalists were resettled to, was clearly superior from a sort of logistical standpoint. Why it was abandoned, I don't know. It's tough to say, but it definitely suggests that Mauchiyacta was an important political center, and we can see the pull of its influence in its resettlement up to Mauchiyacta. So, on the other hand, pastoralists are in the they have very different logistical issues. They need to move around. Like agriculturalists, their fields aren't going anywhere, so they can be in one place as long as it's in the right place, right? But pastoralists need to move around, or else they're gonna overgraze these swampy resource patches and turn them into a wasteland, right? And alpacas in particular do not range very far. They like to range maybe 1 kilometer a day. So you basically set up your estancia. So here's modern herders right next door to Mauchiyacta, actually, where they live and then they rotate. They move to another estancia. They move to another bofedal, and so they need to move around, right? So essentially what you have is half the population is composed of these ranking pastoralist IUs, and they continue to mediate extraction under Spanish colonial rule. And then you have the other half of the population displaced from the agricultural zone below, and they have this much heavier resettlement burden. So you've got pastoralists win out in terms of the resettlement game, essentially, but they need to move around, whereas agriculturalists can be settled, but they're in the wrong place, which is the conclusion of the book works in that direction, where I look at subsequent parish records, and the parish records from the late 18th century shows that like 40% of the population is living in estancias, and they're disproportionately from Anansaya. So they're not even living in Mauchiyacta anymore. It becomes a kind of semi-vacant center. And so there's more people proportionally there living from Urinsaya. The population has crashed to half of what it was. And they eventually resettled downslope to the modern town of Tuti. So that's sort of the story in a nutshell. And it speaks to the different, not just the logistical pull of these different modes of production, but probably as well, what's interesting is where specifically the new town gets built and how it gets built. They sort of spontaneously build another reducción without state oversight. So that this ideology of reducción, once it's instilled, it becomes the default way that you organize yourself, and that you make a claim against vis-a-vis the state as well. To be a civic community, you have to be a kind of properly organized one. So the modern town of Tuti is a sort of a reducción that gets built spontaneously, in a sense. So I'll leave it there, and if you guys have any questions, I've got more slides too. All right? Thanks. All right. Yeah.
So let's see, since I have to run, I'll take the first one really fast. So this was really compelling, especially at the end where you unfold the argument. But at the beginning, you showed us some 500 towns, of which you're guessing there are thousands.
Right.
So I guess the obvious question is, what is your sense about your conclusions for the one town versus the pattern?
Yeah, that's always the challenge of microhistory, right? So, I mean, I do have points of comparison from other studies. I think it's a very different dynamic, and so part of what we're going to do with the other macro scale project is a sort of sampling project where we look at sub-regional variations and interregional variation. How typical is this? We really don't know. We really don't know. I think that it's going to vary on who specific. It'll be interesting to see, for instance, my hypothesis would be, we're going to see significant variation depending on who the specific magistrate that resettled these people was, what his politics was, right? So it just so happens that in this case, this magistrate encounters a very powerful big ethnic group. This was like the breadbasket for the city of Arequipa in the south of Peru. And so it was very important politically. And so it may be that there's a pretty high degree of continuity in where people were resettled to, like in this case, right? So there was a big Inca site. And that's something I didn't mention, but basically most of the reducciones in this valley are built on top of old Inca centers. Now we don't even know like how common that is. We don't even know what proportion of reducciones were abandoned. But tracing out this sort of biography of this town gives us, I think, a starting point for thinking about the issues. And it'll be interesting to see how representative it is. I mean, like Parker van Valkenburg, a colleague that I'm collaborating on the macro project with, he works mostly on the coast. And it's a different story there because there the Spanish kind of were more directly interested in just extracting the resources. They were more attuned to living on the coast. The Spanish weren't interested in living in the highlands that much. It was sort of Indian country, and outside of the major cities, you really didn't see very many Spanish colonials besides the priests. And so what you see on the coast is it's decimation. It's 80–90% population decline. It's marginalization to the most marginal kinds of environmental conditions. Where here you have a degree of autonomy, and it's the reduction form itself provides a kind of a mode of engagement with the state that enables a kind of a set of claims that can be made. So what happens, for example, is the IUs sort of transmogrify into confraternities in the religious calendar and the religious. So so by the 19th century, you don't even see IU in the documents anymore. You hear about the confraternities, which are kind of surrogates for IUs. On the coast, there is some of that, but the communities are displaced to a much greater degree, I think. So, long rambling answer, but thanks. All right. Any other thoughts? Yeah. So, yeah.
I guess one question is, with the heat mapping of the ceramics, how do you account for the outliers? So you have in a couple of images that you show an aggregation in certain areas, and then in one spot somewhere a bit of a distance away,
Right.
consistently, right?
So Right.
Is it something about that particular site, or is there something you can infer based on that?
Right. So we wanted to excavate at that spot that's sort of way out there. Yeah. So what we're actually mapping in that case too, just because I kind of zoomed through that, was we're mapping. What we're doing is we're taking the dense. So we collected. It's called dog leash collections. So you literally put a stake in the ground and you do a radius and you collect everything within the radius. And what that does is it gives you a known area, and then you calculate densities. And so then you have point data with a density on it, and then you can interpolate that into a surface of densities. So you have a density surface of ceramics. And so yeah, we have, so in other words, we have a very irregular collection scheme, but it's based on, we didn't want to just impose a grid on the site and have a sample, because we'd be cutting across like domestic compounds and stuff. So we have an irregular grid, but once you calculate densities, you can interpolate that into a surface like that. So those are real sort of concentrations. So then the question becomes like, what's going on up there, right? And we just didn't have time to dig up there this past summer, but that's going to be a great dissertation for somebody. Because yeah, I mean, just the sampling issue is enormous. But what we did try to do is, what we did do is excavate on either side of the Anansaya Urinsaya division. And so what I think the concept there was, if it's the case that Urinsaya is mostly agriculturalists and Anansaya is mostly pastoralists, those households may look different in terms of their internal spatial organization, their assemblages, what kinds of artifacts, and that sort of thing. So, that's going to take years of analysis to disentangle, but that's sort of that's the next book, actually, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right.
Okay, well, if nobody has questions, we can continue the conversation.
Yeah, totally.
Over cheese, wine, soda.
And then run downtown.
Yeah. All right, thanks so much.
See you guys.